Have you ever watched someone simply walk away, no argument, no explanation, no dramatic goodbye, and wondered what kind of person could do that? Most people beg for closure. They explain, they justify, they fight to be understood. But then there are those rare individuals who just leave quietly, completely, and they never look back. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most provocative thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, had a brutal answer for why this happens. Born on October 15, 1844, in a small Prussian village called Rürken bei Lützen, Nietzsche dedicated his life to understanding what separates the truly strong from the merely loud. And what he discovered was not comfortable. It was not polite, but it was the truth, the man behind the philosophy. Before we can understand what Nietzsche said about strength and silence, we need to understand the man himself. Nietzsche's father, a Lutheran preacher, died when Friedrich was just 4 years old. He was raised in a household dominated by women, his mother, grandmother, and sister, surrounded by religious devotion and conventional morality. And yet, from his earliest years, something inside him refused to conform. By 1869, at just 24 years old, Nietzsche had become a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland, one of the youngest professors ever appointed to such a position in Europe. He was brilliant, he was admired, and he was completely alone in his thinking. His major works, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883, Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and Twilight of the Idols, 1889, challenged everything his society believed about God, morality, and the nature of human strength. Most people around him did not understand him. He never felt the need to convince them. The herd and the individual. Nietzsche believed that the majority of human beings live what he called a herd mentality, following the crowd, seeking approval, terrified of standing apart. In Beyond Good and Evil, he wrote about slave morality, the idea that conventional society promotes weakness disguised as virtue, humility, submission, the desperate need for validation. These are not signs of goodness, Nietzsche argued. They are signs of fear. The strong individual, what Nietzsche called the Ubermensch, or overman, operates by an entirely different code. According to Nietzsche's philosophy, the overman is a being who transcends conventional morality, creates their own values, and refuses to justify themselves to a world that cannot comprehend their vision. This is not arrogance, it is clarity. The overman does not walk away in anger. They walk away because they understand something the crowd does not. That explaining yourself to people who are not ready to hear the truth is a waste of the only resource that truly matters, your energy. The will to power, misunderstood for over a century. One of Nietzsche's most misunderstood concepts is the will to power, in German, Will zur Macht. Most people hear power and imagine domination, control over others, brute force. That is exactly what Nietzsche did not mean. The will to power, as Nietzsche first introduced it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 1883, is fundamentally about self-mastery. It is about commanding yourself, your impulses, your fears, your need for approval rather than commanding others. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche summarized it with devastating precision. What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. Think about that for a moment. According to this framework, the person who argues, who defends, who chases someone who has already emotionally left, that person is not fighting for truth. They are fighting because weakness demands an audience. The truly strong person needs no audience. They already know what they know. Why strong people don't explain. Nietzsche wrote in Ex Homo, of what is great one must either be silent or speak with greatness. This single line contains the entire philosophy of silent departure. When a strong person walks away without explaining, it is not cruelty. It is not coldness. It is the recognition that certain conversations have already ended, even if the other person has not yet realized it. The need to explain yourself comes from a deep-seated fear. The fear that if others do not understand your reasons, you are somehow wrong. It is the desperate hunger for external validation that Nietzsche spent his entire career diagnosing as the root of human weakness. He wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. Strong people have already paid that price. They have made peace with being misunderstood. The psychology of silence, what science confirms modern psychology, actually supports what Nietzsche understood instinctively. Research in emotional intelligence consistently shows that individuals with high self-regulation, the ability to manage their own emotional responses without seeking external validation, are measurably more resilient, more decisive, and more effective in their lives. The person who needs to explain, to justify, to get the last word is not stronger. They are less regulated. They are still ruled by what others think. Nietzsche was ahead of this science by over a century. He understood that the compulsive need for understanding from others is itself a form of dependency, what he called ressentiment, a French word meaning resentment, but which for Nietzsche described something deeper, the psychology of those who define themselves by the judgment of others. When you walk away without explaining, you are declaring, silently, completely, that your sense of self does not depend on their verdict. Nietzsche's own silent departures. Nietzsche did not just preach this philosophy, he lived it. His friendship with the composer Richard Wagner, one of the most celebrated artists of the 19th century, was once the defining relationship of his intellectual life. Nietzsche had admired Wagner deeply, dedicating his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, largely to Wagnerian aesthetics. But by the mid-1870s, as Wagner descended into German nationalism and what Nietzsche saw as a pandering to mass audiences, he simply walked away. There was no dramatic public falling out at first, no manifesto, just distance, and then silence. Later in his book Human, All Too Human, 1878, Nietzsche made his departure public not as an attack, but as a statement of his own evolution. He did not beg Wagner to change. He did not demand understanding. He moved on to his own path, one that would prove far more enduring than any friendship. Nietzsche's later work, the very work that changed Western philosophy, was written almost entirely in isolation, often in boarding houses in Switzerland and Italy, in chronic physical pain, largely unrecognized by the world that would eventually celebrate him. The price of self-ownership. Nietzsche wrote, "Every deep thinker is more afraid of being understood than of being misunderstood." On the surface, this seems paradoxical. Why would anyone fear being understood? But Nietzsche's point was precise. When you are truly seen, truly understood, you become accountable to that understanding. You become definable. And to be definable is to be limited. The strong person, the person who has done the work of self-creation, guards their interior world not out of secrecy, but out of the knowledge that most people are not equipped to handle what lives there. This is why strong people walk away without explaining, not because they are cold, not because they do not feel. Often, they feel everything more intensely than the people around them. But they have learned through pain, through solitude, through the long hard work of becoming, that their truth is not something that needs to be defended in the court of public opinion. It is simply true. What Nietzsche would say to you today. If Friedrich Nietzsche were alive today and watching you refresh your phone, waiting for a reply that explains why someone left, he would be brutally direct. He would say that your suffering is not coming from their silence. It is coming from your own inability to tolerate the possibility that you do not require their explanation to move forward. He would say that the moment you stop needing to understand and be understood is the moment you begin to actually live. The person who walked away without explaining was not necessarily right in what they did. Nietzsche was never interested in comfortable morality. But they were demonstrating something real, that they had, at some point, made a decision about the direction of their energy. And that direction did not include the endless loop of justification that most people mistake for connection. Nietzsche called this kind of self-directed movement the will to power. The world calls it, somewhat more gently, letting go. The closing truth. Friedrich Nietzsche collapsed on a street in Turin, Italy, in January 1889. He was 44 years old. The last decade of his life was spent in mental incapacitation. The cause still debated by historians, attributed variously to a brain tumor, hereditary illness, or the cumulative weight of a mind that had never stopped working at the absolute limit of its capacity. He died on August 25, 1900, largely unknown to the world that would later claim to have always understood him. That is the final irony of Nietzsche's life. The man who argued most powerfully that strong people do not need to be understood by the masses was himself deeply misunderstood for most of his life. And yet, he did not stop writing. He did not demand the world catch up to him. He simply kept going, in silence, in pain, with absolute fidelity to his own vision. That, more than any quote on the internet, is the real Nietzsche. That is the brutal truth about strength. The question is not whether someone owes you an explanation. The question Nietzsche would ask is this: when will you stop needing one?